Tonight's story begins with a question that sounds simple but cuts to the bone of what makes us human. Why did we invent the alphabet? Not writing itself, that's older, stranger, more scattered across time. But the alphabet, 26 letters that can spell infinity. A code so elegant that a child can learn it, yet so powerful it carries every thought we've ever had worth preserving. But here's what haunts the story. The first written words aren't 5,000 years old. They're not even 10,000. Deep in caves across Europe, are carved into bone and antler by hands that knew nothing of cities or kings, we find marks. Deliberate marks, repeated marks. Marks that whisper of counting, of seasons, of something that might, just might, be the first human attempt to make the invisible visible. These marks are 1,000 years old, maybe older. The story we're told in school goes like this. Humans lived for millions of years without writing. Then around 200 BCE, the Sumerians invented to keep track of grain and sheep. Then the Egyptians made hieroglyphs. Then the Phoenicians simplified everything into an alphabet. Then the Greeks added vowels. Then the Romans spread it everywhere. The end. But that story, clean as it is, misses something profound. It misses the 15,000 years of human struggle that came before the first clay tablet. It misses the deep time when our ancestors, barely clothed against the Ice Age cold, already felt the need to make marks that meant something. It misses the mystery of why a species fighting for survival would spend precious energy trying to capture time itself. Because that's what writing is, isn't it? It's time travel. It's the desperate human attempt to speak to people who aren't born yet, to preserve thoughts that would otherwise die with the thinker. And that impulse, that refusal to let meaning vanish, is older than agriculture, older than cities, older than everything we think of as civilization. If you appreciate this kind of long-form storytelling, calm, factual, and a little different from everything else out there, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. It might feel like a small gesture, but it helps this kind of content reach more people. People who, like you, are curious, and I'd love to know how you use this channel. Do you put it on before bed, while you're driving, maybe while you're working? Or simply tell me what time of day you find yourself here, and from where in the world you're listening. Sharing that not only helps me, but also lets others know they're part of something bigger than themselves. Oh, and if you happen to drift off in some of the chapters, don't worry. I put timestamps in the description, so the next day you can pick the story up exactly where you left it, because this is a story best heard from beginning to end. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. In a cave in southwestern France, in the flickering light of animal fat lamps, someone made a choice. Not the choice to hunt or gather or seek shelter. Those were survival. This was something else. They picked up a piece of flint and began to scratch. Not randomly, not accidentally. Line after line, mark after mark, with intention so clear it still echoes 20,000 years later. These weren't pictures. They weren't decorations. They were something more abstract, more haunting. They were humanity's first attempt to catch time itself and pin it to bone. We call them tallies now, though we're not entirely sure what they were tallying. At Aubry-Blanchard, a rock shelter in France's Dordogne Valley, archaeologist Alexander Marchak discovered a piece of bone covered in tiny notches. Not random scratches, but deliberate marks arranged in patterns, some grouped in sets of 7, others in sets that corresponded to lunar months. This bone is 30,000 years old, carved when mammoths still walked the earth and ice sheets covered most of northern Europe. Similar marks appear across the prehistoric world. In the Lubombo Mountains of South Africa, a baboon bone bears 29 notches that match the days of a lunar month. It's 44,000 years old, older than the oldest cave paintings, older than any known art, older than anything else that looks like symbolic thought. At Ishango, along the shores of ancient Lake Edward, in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, another bone from 25,000 years ago displays complex mathematical patterns that suggest not just counting, but calculation. What were they counting? The phases of the moon, perhaps, the days until the herds returned, the members of their group, the season since someone died. We don't know. But the act itself tells us something profound. These people had moved beyond the immediate present. They were thinking about yesterday and tomorrow, about patterns that repeated, about time itself as something that could be measured and marked. This is where writing begins, not with the invention of letters, but with the realization that marks could hold meaning. That a scratch in bone could represent something absent, something invisible, something that existed only in the mind. It's a cognitive leap so fundamental we barely notice it now, but it represents one of the most important moments in human development. Consider what this required. The person making these marks had to believe that future selves, or future others, would return to this bone and understand what the marks meant. They had to conceive of meaning as something separate from the present moment, something that could be stored and retrieved. They had to invent the very concept of a record, but these Ice Age marks were more than just early accounting. At sites like Taille-Plage and Mas-d'Iezil in France, researchers have found bones and antlers covered in what appear to be lunar calendars, tracking the phases of the moon across multiple cycles. Some show wear patterns suggesting they were consulted repeatedly, carried from camp to camp, referenced across seasons. These weren't just tallies. They were tools for prediction, for planning, for thinking about time in ways no creature had ever thought before. The implications are staggering. These people, who left no cities or monuments, who wrote no histories or poems, who struggled daily just to stay alive in an Ice Age world, had already grasped the fundamental principle that would eventually give us the alphabet, that abstract concepts could be made concrete through marks, that the invisible world of thought could be projected onto the visible world of objects. Yet there's something haunting about these early marks. They're so simple, so basic, that they barely register as writing at all. Just lines and dots and notches. No complexity, no sophistication, no obvious beauty. And yet they represent one of the most sophisticated cognitive achievements in human history, the birth of external memory. Before these marks, everything humans knew had to be held in the mind. Every story, every piece of knowledge, every important fact existed only as long as someone remembered it. Death meant erasure, forgetting meant permanent loss, but with the first intentional mark, that changed. Suddenly, memory could exist outside the brain. Information could survive the death of the informant. This wasn't just a new technology, it was a new form of consciousness. For the first time, humans could think with objects as well as brains. They could externalize cognition, storing thoughts in the physical world for later retrieval. The scratch on bone became an extension of the mind, a prosthetic for memory, and once that boundary was crossed, there was no going back. The marks became more complex, more varied, more meaningful. At La Marche in France, 14,000-year-old stones bear not just tallies, but what appear to be maps, tracking animal migrations or water sources. At G. Nennersdorf in Germany, mammoth ivory plaques show abstract patterns that might represent seasonal changes or astronomical observations. We'll never know exactly what these ancient marks meant to the people who made them. The languages they spoke have vanished. The stories they told have died with them. The meanings they encoded in bone and stone are lost forever. But the marks themselves remain, silent witnesses to humanity's first encounter with the power of symbolic representation. What we can say is this: by 20,000 years ago, humans had already developed the cognitive foundation for everything that would follow. They understood that marks could mean things. They grasped that patterns could represent concepts. They had invented the basic grammar of visual symbolism that would eventually grow into hieroglyphs, cuneiform, and alphabets. But perhaps most importantly, they had discovered that thoughts didn't have to die with thinkers, that the inside of one mind could somehow reach across time to touch another. That scratches on bone could be a form of time travel, carrying messages from the deep past into an unknowable future. Standing in those caves today, looking at those ancient marks by flashlight, it's impossible not to feel the weight of that first breakthrough. These people whose names we'll never know, whose faces we'll never see, whose voices we'll never hear, somehow found a way to speak directly to us across 20,000 years, not in words, but in something deeper. in the recognition that meaning matters enough to preserve. They couldn't have known they were beginning the story of writing. They couldn't have imagined that their simple marks would eventually evolve into the alphabet you're encountering right now. But in choosing to make those first intentional scratches, they set in motion a chain of innovations that would fundamentally change what it means to be human. Because once you can store thoughts outside your head, everything changes. Memory becomes cumulative, knowledge becomes transferable, culture becomes immortal. The marks on those Ice Age bones don't look like much, but they represent the moment humanity began its long journey toward literacy. And that journey was about to accelerate in ways those first mark makers could never have imagined. The first accountants weren't poets. They were farmers with too much grain and too little memory. Somewhere in the fertile valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, around 8,000 years ago, someone needed to remember how many sheep belonged to whom, how much barley was stored, how many jars of oil were traded. Clay was cheap, memory was not. And so, almost by accident, the first true writing system was born, not from the desire to capture beauty or truth, but from the grinding necessity of keeping track. It began with tokens, small clay objects shaped like the things they represented, tiny clay sheep for actual sheep, miniature clay jars for real jars of oil, con-shaped tokens for measures of grain. This wasn't writing yet, it was three-dimensional bookkeeping, but it was systematic, standardized, and it worked. Archaeological evidence suggests this token system emerged around 80 BCE and spread throughout the ancient Near East. At sites like Jarmo in Iraq and Tel Es-Sorwan in Syria, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of these small clay objects in contexts that suggest they were used for record keeping and trade. The tokens weren't random, each shape had a consistent meaning that was understood across different communities. But the system had a problem. Tokens could be lost, stolen, or disputed. How could you prove you had given someone 5 sheep if the sheep tokens disappeared? The solution was brilliant in its simplicity, but the tokens inside sealed clay envelopes. The envelope would show how many tokens were inside, and if there was ever a dispute, it could be broken open to verify the contents. The next step seems inevitable in hindsight, but it was revolutionary at the time. Why put actual tokens inside the envelope when you could just mark the outside with impressions that represented what was inside? Why waste clay on tiny sheep when you could just press the shape of a sheep into the envelope's surface? By 500 BCE, these envelope markings had evolved into something recognizable as writing. Instead of pressing actual tokens into clay, scribes began using special tools to make standardized impressions. The wedge-shaped stylus that gave cuneiform its name, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, could create all the basic shapes needed to represent the old token system. But something strange happened as this accounting system became more sophisticated. The marks began to represent not just objects, but the sounds of the words for those objects. A symbol that meant water could also represent the sound, because that's how you said water in Sumerian. Suddenly, the same symbol could mean the thing itself or just its sound, which could be combined with other sounds to spell completely different words. This was the breakthrough that transformed bookkeeping into writing. For the first time, you could record not just 5 sheep, but 5 sheep belonging to a Nilbani, given to Shamash Hazir on the day the barley was harvested. You could record not just quantities but stories, not just transactions but relationships, not just facts but context. The evidence for this transformation is written in clay across dozens of ancient sites. At Vurruk, the world's first city, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of early cuneiform tablets dating from 200 to 300 BCE. Most are still just accounting records, lists of livestock, measures of grain, inventories of goods. But among them are the first signs of something more, the first tentative attempts to record language itself. One of the most famous early examples is a tablet from Kish dating to around 200 BCE. It contains what appears to be a list of words arranged not for accounting purposes, but for educational ones, an early example of a teaching text, suggesting that by this time, writing had become complex enough to require formal instruction. The scribes who developed this system weren't trying to create literature. They were solving practical problems. How do you manage the resources of a city of 50,000 people? How do you track debts and credits across complex trading networks? How do you ensure that taxes are collected and distributed fairly? But in solving these mundane problems, they accidentally invented something far more powerful than they could have imagined. Because once you can write down the sounds of words, you can write down anything that can be said. Once you can record language, you can record thought itself. The boundary between the spoken and the written dissolves, and suddenly the full range of human expression becomes available to the stylus. It took time for the Mesopotamians to realize what they had created. For centuries, cuneiform remained primarily a tool for administration and trade, but gradually, scribes began to experiment with its broader possibilities. By 2600 BCE, we find the first literary works, hymns to gods, stories of heroes, love songs, and laments. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's first great works of literature, was composed in cuneiform around 100 BCE. But even more revolutionary was what cuneiform did to human consciousness. For the first time in history, thoughts could be perfectly preserved and perfectly reproduced. A king's proclamation written in Babylon could be copied exactly in Assyria. A mathematical formula discovered in one generation could be transmitted unchanged to the next. A poem composed in Sumerian could be translated into Akkadian while preserving its meter and meaning. This was the birth of what we might call frozen speech, language that existed independent of any speaker, that could travel across space and time without degradation. It was the beginning of literature, of law, of history, of all the ways we use writing to transcend the limitations of individual memory and individual lifespan. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia reveal this transformation in real time. The earliest tablets are crude, inconsistent, clearly the work of people still figuring out what they were doing. The symbols are irregular, the meanings often ambiguous, the grammar simplified to the point of near incomprehensibility. But within a few centuries, the tablets show signs of standardization, sophistication, and artistic ambition. By 2000 BCE, Mesopotamian scribes had developed one of the most complex and powerful writing systems in human history. Cuneiform could record multiple languages, from Sumerian to Akkadian to Hittite to Elamite. It could handle poetry as easily as prose, religious hymns as naturally as business contracts. It had evolved from a simple accounting tool into a complete technology for capturing and transmitting human thought. And yet, for all its power, cuneiform was also monstrously complex. It required hundreds of different symbols, each with multiple meanings depending on context. Learning to read and write cuneiform took years of intensive study, making literacy the preserve of a small professional class. It was a dead end, evolutionarily speaking, too complex to spread widely, too specialized to adapt easily to new languages. But the Mesopotamian innovation had planted a seed that would grow in unexpected directions. The idea that sounds could be represented by symbols, that speech could be frozen into marks, that thoughts could outlive thinkers. These concepts spread beyond the clay tablets of Sumer and Babylon. Other peoples, facing their own needs for record keeping and communication, would take this basic insight and reshape it into something simpler, more flexible, more revolutionary. The alphabet was still 2,000 years away, but its foundation had been laid in the accounting houses of ancient Mesopotamia. The clerks who pressed their styluses into wet clay to record sheep and barley couldn't have known they were launching a revolution. They were just trying to keep track of things. But in doing so, they crossed the threshold from marks that looked like things to marks that sounded like words. And once that crossing was made, everything else became possible. The haunting truth is that writing began not with inspiration, but with bureaucracy. Not with the desire to create beauty, but with the need to prevent theft. The first writers weren't poets or prophets, but accountants and tax collectors. And yet, from these humble beginnings came the technology that would eventually give us everything from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the plays of Shakespeare to the messages flowing across digital networks today. In the end, the Mesopotamian accident wasn't really an accident at all. It was the inevitable result of humans living in groups large enough to exceed the capacity of individual memory. Once societies became too complex for any one person to keep track of everything that mattered, some form of external record-keeping became essential. The specific form it took, wedge-shaped marks in clay, was accidental, but the need for it was written into the logic of civilization itself. Hieroglyphs were never meant to be mysterious. To the scribes who carved them into temple walls and painted them on papyrus, they were as practical as a shopping list. A bird meant bird, a house meant house, a man with his arms raised meant joy. But something strange happened as Egyptian writing evolved over centuries of use. The pictures began to whisper. A drawing of a bee could mean the sound, bee. Even you weren't talking about bees at all. It was the first crack in the wall between image and sound, and through that crack, the alphabet would eventually crawl. The story begins along the Nile around 200 BCE, roughly contemporary with the first cuneiform tablets in Mesopotamia. But where Mesopotamian writing grew from clay cones and accounting needs, Egyptian hieroglyphs emerged from a different impulse, the desire to make divine kingship visible and permanent. The earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions we've found are carved into ivory labels and stone palettes celebrating royal victories and religious ceremonies. From the beginning, Egyptian writing was more than functional, it was sacred. The word hieroglyph itself means sacred carving, and the Egyptians believed that their writing system had been given to them by Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. Each symbol was not just a mark, but a piece of divine power made manifest on earth. To read hieroglyphs was to participate in the language of the gods. This reverence for the written word shaped how hieroglyphs developed. Unlike Mesopotamian cuneiform, which simplified over time to increase efficiency, Egyptian hieroglyphs retained their pictorial beauty throughout their 3,000-year history. A bird symbol always looked like a bird. A house symbol always looked like a house. The writing system sacrificed simplicity for visual power, practicality for sacred aesthetics. But beneath this surface conservatism, something revolutionary was happening. Egyptian scribes were discovering that pictures could do more than just picture things. They could capture the sounds of spoken language. A hieroglyph that looked like a bee and meant bee could also represent the sound bee, when that sound appeared in other words. A symbol for a house, pronounced per, in ancient Egyptian could be used to write the sound per, even in words that had nothing to do with houses. This breakthrough, called the rebus principle, was the key that unlocked the alphabet. For the first time, written symbols could represent pure sound, divorced from meaning. A picture of a bee could help spell the word believe, even though believe had nothing to do with bees. This made it possible to write any word in the language, even abstract concepts that couldn't be drawn. The evidence for this transformation is carved in stone across Egypt. The Nama palette, dating to around 100 BCE, shows early hieroglyphs being used both pictorially and phonetically. The pharaoh's name is spelled out using symbols that represent sounds rather than meanings. By the time of the pyramid texts, carved into the burial chambers of Old Kingdom pharaohs around 400 BCE, Egyptian scribes had developed a sophisticated mixed system that combined pictographic, ideographic, and phonetic elements. Or consider the Egyptian word hotep, meaning peace, satisfaction. It could be written with a picture of an altar which represented the concept of peace, or it could be spelled out phonetically using symbols the sounds ho, t, and p. Often, scribes used both methods together, spelling the word phonetically and then adding a picture as a determinative to clarify the meaning. This redundancy might seem inefficient, but it reveals something profound about how the Egyptians understood writing. They saw it not as a simple transcription of speech, but as a parallel form of communication with its own logic and aesthetics. A hieroglyphic text wasn't just written language, it was visual art that happened to carry linguistic meaning. The most remarkable example of this dual nature is found in Egyptian royal names, or cartouches. Every pharaoh had multiple names, each carrying specific religious and political significance. These names were written inside oval loops called cartouches, which marked them as royal and sacred. The hieroglyphs within these cartouches were purely phonetic. They spelled out the sounds of the royal names without regard to pictorial meaning. When Napoleon's soldiers discovered the Rosetta Stone in 1799, it was these royal cartouches that provided the first key to decipherment. Jean Franeroy's Champollion realized that the hieroglyphs inside the cartouches must represent sounds rather than pictures, because they corresponded to the Greek royal names on the same stone. From this insight, he was able to crack the phonetic principle of hieroglyphic writing and unlock 3,000 years of Egyptian literature. But the Egyptians weren't content with just one writing system. Alongside the formal hieroglyphs used for religious and royal inscriptions, they developed cursive scripts for everyday use. Hieratic, a simplified form of hieroglyphs written with brush and ink on papyrus, was used for business documents, personal letters, and literary texts. Later came Demotic, an even more simplified script that bore little visual resemblance to the original hieroglyphs. These cursive scripts were purely functional. Speed and efficiency mattered more than sacred aesthetics. In adapting hieroglyphs for everyday use, Egyptian scribes were unconsciously moving toward the efficiency that would eventually characterize alphabetic writing. The complex pictures of formal hieroglyphs became simple strokes and curves that be written quickly with a brush. The social context of Egyptian writing was as important as its technical development. Unlike Mesopotamia, where writing remained primarily a tool for administration and trade, Egypt developed a rich literary tradition almost from the beginning. The pyramid texts, which date to around 400 BCE, are among the world's religious literature. The instructions of Pahotep and other wisdom texts, composed around 400 BCE, represent some of humanity's earliest moral philosophy. Egyptian literature also gave us some of the world's first fiction. The Shipwrecked Sailor, composed around 2000 BCE, tells the fantastical story of a sailor who survives a shipwreck and encounters a talking serpent on a magical island. The story of Sinya, from around 1800 BCE, recounts the adventures of an Egyptian official who flees to Asia and eventually returns home. These weren't religious or instructional texts. They were stories told for the pleasure of storytelling. This literary flowering was possible because Egyptian hieroglyphs had solved the fundamental problem of how to write spoken language. By combining pictographic, ideographic, and phonetic elements, hieroglyphs could capture not just the meaning of words but their sound, rhythm, and emotional tone. A poem written in hieroglyphs preserved not just its ideas but its music. Yet, for all their sophistication and beauty, Egyptian hieroglyphs contained the seeds of their own obsolescence. The phonetic principle they had discovered, that symbols could represent sounds independent of meaning, pointed toward a much simpler system. If symbols could represent sounds, why have hundreds of different symbols? Why not have one symbol for each sound in the language? The Egyptians themselves seem to have sensed this possibility. Buried within their complex writing system was a set of about 24 symbols that represented single consonant sounds. These alphabetic hieroglyphs were used alongside the pictographic and ideographic symbols, but they could theoretically have done the job alone. An inscription written entirely with these 24 symbols would have been perfectly readable to anyone who knew the language. But the Egyptians never took this final step. The sacred nature of their writing system, its role in royal and religious ceremonies, its visual beauty, all of these factors conspired to preserve the complex traditional system. Hieroglyphs were too important as religious and artistic objects to be reduced to mere efficiency. It would take outsiders, people who encountered Egyptian writing as a practical tool rather than a sacred tradition, to extract the alphabetic principle from the hieroglyphic system and develop it into something simpler. These outsiders lived not in the Nile Valley, but in the harsh desert regions where Egypt's influence met other cultures. They were miners and traders, people who needed to write, but couldn't afford the years of training required to master traditional Egyptian scribal education. They would take the Egyptians' greatest discovery, that pictures could represent sounds, and strip away everything else. In doing so, they would create something the Egyptians never could have imagined, a writing system so simple that anyone could learn it, so flexible that it could write any language, so portable that it could spread across the world. The hieroglyphs had done their job. They had preserved the sound principle long enough for someone else to discover its true potential. In the copper mines of the Sinai Peninsula, far from the temples and palaces where hieroglyphs were born, that potential was about to be realized. In the copper mines of the Sinai Peninsula, far from the grand temples of Egypt and the ziggurats of Babylon, a group of Semitic workers made a discovery that would reshape human thought forever. They looked at Egyptian hieroglyphs, those complex, beautiful, impossible symbols, and asked a simple question. What if we kept the sounds but threw away the pictures? What emerged from that question was humanity's first alphabet, scratched into rock by people whose names we'll never know, in a place where survival mattered more than beauty. The Sinai Peninsula in the 2nd millennium BCE was a harsh frontier, a desert buffer zone between the civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Egyptian pharaohs controlled the region because it contained something precious, turquoise and copper mines that fed the Egyptian economy. To work these mines, they imported Semitic-speaking workers from Canaan, people who spoke languages related to Hebrew and Arabic, but wrote, if they wrote at all, in borrowed Egyptian hieroglyphs. These workers faced a practical problem. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing was enormously complex, requiring knowledge of hundreds of symbols and years of training. It was a system designed for professional scribes, not for miners and traders who needed to keep simple records or leave basic messages. But they had absorbed something crucial from their exposure to Egyptian writing, the idea that symbols could represent the sounds of speech. Their solution was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of learning hundreds of hieroglyphic symbols, they selected just a few, perhaps 24, and assigned each one to represent a single sound in their own Semitic language. They kept the pictorial form of the Egyptian symbols, but discarded their complex Egyptian meanings. A hieroglyph that looked like a house, for instance, represented not the Egyptian concept of house, but simply the sound, B, the first sound of the Semitic word for house, bait. This was the birth of the acrophonic principle, using a picture to represent not the thing it showed, but the first sound of that thing's name. It was a conceptual breakthrough that seems obvious in hindsight, but required a cognitive leap that had never been made before. For the first time, someone had imagined a writing system where symbols had no meaning except as markers of sound. The earliest evidence for this proto-Sinaitic alphabet appears in inscriptions carved into rocks and mine walls throughout the Sinai Peninsula, dating to around 701–500 BCE. These inscriptions are rough, inconsistent, clearly the work of people who were still figuring out their system. The symbols vary in form and orientation, sometimes written left to right, sometimes right to left, sometimes in vertical columns. Most proto-Sinaitic inscriptions are frustratingly brief, just a few words, often names or short dedicatory phrases. One of the most famous, carved into a sphinx statue at Serabit Eldim, reads something like, "This offering which Amat made to the lady." Another, scratched into a rock face, appears to say, "This is the drawing which Hizamak made." These aren't literature or laws or royal proclamations. They're the everyday graffiti of working people who had found a way to make writing their own. But buried in these simple inscriptions is evidence of something revolutionary. The proto-Sinaitic alphabet contained only about 20–30 symbols, each representing a single consonant sound. This made it potentially learnable by anyone who could memorize a simple list, no years of scribal training required. It was writing democratized, literacy made accessible to people who had never had access to the written word before. The genius of the system was its economy. Instead of the 7,000 tut symbols needed for Egyptian hieroglyphs or the 6,000 signs of Mesopotamian cuneiform, the Proto-Sinaitic alphabet achieved the same communicative power with a tiny fraction of the complexity. It was like replacing a library with a pocket notebook, vastly simpler but capable of carrying the same information. Yet this simplicity came at a cost. The Proto-Sinaitic alphabet, like all early Semitic scripts, recorded only consonants. Vowel sounds, which were crucial for understanding meaning, had to be supplied by the reader based on context and linguistic knowledge. This meant that script worked best for native speakers of the language who could fill in the missing vowels automatically. It was less a universal writing system than a sophisticated shorthand for those who already knew what they were reading. The script also maintained some pictorial character, though much simplified compared to Egyptian hieroglyphs. The symbol for water, for instance, still looked recognizably like a wavy line representing water, even though it was used to represent the sound. Neth from the Semitic word mayim, meaning water. The symbol for ox still resembled an ox head, though it represented the sound, from halaf, the Semitic word for ox. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Proto-Sinaitic script spread quickly beyond the mines where it was invented. Similar inscriptions have been found throughout Canaan, the Levant, and even in Egypt itself. This geographic distribution suggests that the alphabet was being used by traders, travelers, and migrants. People who needed a portable writing system that could work across different languages and cultures. One of the most intriguing aspects of Proto-Sinaitic writing is how quickly it evolved from a local innovation to a widespread phenomenon. Within a few centuries, variants of the alphabet appeared across the ancient Near East. At Lachish in Israel, archaeologists have found a dagger with alphabetic inscriptions dating to around 500 BCE. At Gezer, an ostracon inscribed pottery fragment from around 1000 BCE shows the alphabet being used for what appears to be a student's writing exercise, the ancient equivalent of the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. But perhaps the most significant discovery came much later, in 1999, when archaeologists working at Wadi El Hol in southern Egypt uncovered inscriptions that pushed the invention of the alphabet back even further. These Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions, carved into limestone cliffs along an ancient desert road, have been dated to around 900 BCE, making them potentially the oldest alphabetic writing ever discovered. The Wadi El Hol inscriptions are remarkable not just for their age, but for their context. They were found along a trade route used by Asiatic peoples traveling between Egypt and the Levant, suggesting that the alphabet was already being used for commercial and administrative purposes by the early 2nd millennium BCE. One inscription appears to read, "This is the mule of Tor," possibly a livestock brand or ownership mark. What makes these early alphabetic experiments so significant is their democratic character, unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform, which required extensive training and were controlled by professional scribal classes. The Proto-Sinaitic alphabet could be learned and used by ordinary people. It was writing for the masses, literacy without bureaucracy. This accessibility had profound implications for how knowledge and power were distributed in ancient societies. For the first time, writing was not the exclusive preserve of kings, priests, and scribes. Merchants could keep their own records. Soldiers could write their own letters. Ordinary people could participate in the written culture that had previously been monopolized by elites. The alphabet was also remarkably adaptable. Because it was based on sound rather than meaning, it could be applied to any language. The same basic set of symbols could be used to write Semitic languages like Hebrew and Aramaic, Indo-European languages like Greek and Latin, or completely unrelated languages like Berber or Armenian. This universality would prove to be one of the alphabet's greatest strengths. Yet for all its revolutionary potential, the Proto-Sinaitic alphabet remained crude and inconsistent for several centuries. The different regions developed different versions with varying numbers of letters and different symbol forms. There was no standardization, no central authority to regulate how the script should be written. It was a living, evolving system shaped by the practical needs of the people who used it. The real breakthrough came when the alphabet encountered a people who specialized in making connections across cultures, the Phoenicians. These master traders are based in cities along the eastern Mediterranean coast, would take the rough innovation of the Sinai miners and transform it into something that could change the world. But that transformation required more than just technical refinement. It required a different kind of society, one that valued efficiency over tradition, communication over ceremony, practical literacy over sacred writing. The Phoenicians, whose survival depended on their ability to trade with peoples of many different languages and cultures, were perfectly positioned to realize the alphabet's full potential. In the Sinai Peninsula, in the space between empires, between languages, between the settled and the nomadic, the alphabet had been born. It was still rough, still experimental, still searching for its final form. But the essential breakthrough had been made. Writing could be simple. Literacy could be universal. The technology that had once belonged only to scribes and kings could become the birthright of anyone willing to learn 22 symbols. The miners who carved those first alphabetic inscriptions into the desert rocks couldn't have known what they were starting. They were just trying to solve an immediate problem: how to write their own language using tools borrowed from Egyptian civilization. But in solving that problem, they had accidentally invented the most successful information technology in human history. The alphabet was ready to begin its conquest of the world. It just needed the right people to carry it forward. They were traders, not prophets. The Phoenicians sailed from port to port with ships full of purple dye, cedar wood, and something far more valuable than either an idea. 22 letters, that was all. No pictures, no complex symbols, just 22 simple marks that could spell any word, any language they encountered. They weren't trying to change the world. They were just trying to keep better records. But sometimes revolution comes disguised as bookkeeping. The Phoenicians inherited the alphabet from their Canaanite predecessors, who had developed it from the Proto-Sinaitic script of the Sinai miners. But what the Phoenicians did with this inheritance was remarkable. They standardized it, simplified it, and most importantly, they spread it across the known world. By 1000 BCE, Phoenician merchants had established trading posts from Spain to Cyprus, from Sardinia to North Africa, and everywhere they went, they carried their alphabet with them. The Phoenician homeland was a narrow strip of coastline in what is now Lebanon and northern Israel. Cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos became wealthy by serving as intermediaries between the great civilizations of the ancient world. Phoenician ships carried Egyptian gold to Greece, Mesopotamian textiles to Spain, British tin to the eastern Mediterranean. To succeed in this complex web of international trade, they needed a writing system that was portable, learnable, and adaptable to different languages. The cuneiform of Mesopotamia and the hieroglyphs of Egypt were too complex for this purpose. Each required years of training and was tied to specific languages and cultures. The Phoenician alphabet, by contrast, could be learned in weeks and applied to any language. It was the perfect tool for a people whose success depended on communication across cultural boundaries. Archaeological evidence for Phoenician alphabetic writing appears throughout the Mediterranean basin. The Ahiram sarcophagus, discovered in Byblos and dating to around 1000 BCE, bears one of the longest early Phoenician inscriptions, a course against anyone who might disturb the king's tomb. At Nora in Sardinia, a Phoenician stela from the 9th century BCE records the dedication of a temple. In Spain, Phoenician inscriptions have been found at sites from Dis to Helva, evidence of the alphabet's spread to the westernmost edges of the ancient world. But the Phoenicians did more than just spread their alphabet, they refined it. The Proto-Sinaitic script had been inconsistent in its letter forms and direction of writing. The Phoenicians standardized both. They settled on a set of 22 letters with consistent forms and established the convention of writing from right to left. They also simplified the shapes of many letters, making them easier to write quickly with pen, ink on papyrus or parchment. And the Phoenician alphabet was a masterpiece of functional design. Each letter was simple enough to be written quickly, but distinctive enough to be recognized easily. The letters were designed to flow naturally from the movement of a hand holding a writing instrument. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, which often required careful drawing, Phoenician letters could be dashed off in cursive form without losing their identity. Perhaps most importantly, the Phoenicians demonstrated that the alphabet could work for commerce. Their business records, written on papyrus and parchment that has mostly perished, showed that complex commercial transactions could be recorded efficiently using alphabetic writing. A Phoenician merchant could write contracts, keep accounts, and correspond with business partners using the same simple set of 22 symbols. The alphabet's commercial success was crucial to its spread, unlike the sacred scripts of Egypt and Mesopotamia, which were controlled by priestly and royal bureaucracies. The Phoenician alphabet was primarily a tool of trade. It spread along commercial routes, carried by merchants who taught it to their trading partners out of practical necessity rather than religious or cultural imperialism. This commercial character also shaped how the alphabet was perceived by other cultures. It wasn't seen as a threat to traditional writing systems, but as a useful supplement to them. In Egypt, for instance, a Phoenician alphabetic writing was used alongside traditional hieroglyphs for certain purposes. In Mesopotamia, alphabetic inscriptions appear on objects traded by Phoenician merchants, coexisting with cuneiform administrative texts. The Phoenicians also made crucial innovations in writing materials and techniques. They were among the first to use iron styluses for writing on wax tablets, a technique that made writing faster and more economical. They developed improved inks and writing surfaces, making alphabetic writing more practical for everyday use. They even gave us the word alphabet, itself derived from the first two letters of their script, Aleph and Beth. But perhaps the Phoenicians' greatest contribution was their recognition that the alphabet could be adapted to different languages. While they used their script primarily for their own Semitic language, they quickly discovered that the same basic system could be modified to write other languages they encountered in their travels. This adaptability would prove crucial when the alphabet reached peoples who spoke very different languages, like the Greeks. The social impact of Phoenician alphabetic literacy was profound. For the first time in history, writing was not confined to a professional scribal class. Phoenician inscriptions have been found on everything from royal monuments to ordinary pottery, suggesting that literacy was spreading beyond the traditional elite. A ship captain could write his own logs, a merchant keep his own accounts, a craftsman could mark his own products. This democratization of literacy had political implications as well. Alphabetic writing made it possible to record laws, treaties, and administrative decisions in a form that could be read by more people than ever before. The Phoenician cities were among the first to develop what we might recognize as constitutional government, with written laws that applied to rulers as well as subjects. The Phoenicians also pioneered the use of alphabetic writing for religious purposes. While traditional Near Eastern religions relied heavily on oral tradition and priestly interpretation, Phoenician religious texts began to appear in alphabetic script. This made religious knowledge more accessible to ordinary believers and may have contributed to the development of more personal, less institutionalized forms of religion. By 800 BCE, the Phoenician alphabet had established itself as the dominant writing system of the ancient Mediterranean. Phoenician colonies from Cyprus to Carthage used it for all their administrative and commercial needs. More importantly, it had begun to influence the writing systems of other peoples. The Greeks, in particular, were experimenting with adapting the Phoenician alphabet to their own very different language. The Phoenicians had accomplished something remarkable. They had taken a rough innovation from the desert mines of Sinai and transformed it into a sophisticated, standardized, universally applicable writing system. They had proven that the alphabet could work not just for simple inscriptions, but for the full range of human communication needs. They had demonstrated its commercial value, its administrative utility, and its potential for spreading across cultural boundaries. Most importantly, they had shown that alphabetic literacy could be democratic. Unlike the complex scripts that had preceded it, the alphabet did not require years of specialized training or membership in a professional class. It was a technology that could belong to anyone willing to learn it. This democratic character would prove to be the alphabet's greatest strength as it spread beyond the Phoenician world. When the Greeks encountered Phoenician writing in the 8th century BCE, they saw not just a useful commercial tool, but the foundation for something unprecedented. A literate civilization in which writing was not the monopoly of priests and scribes, but the common inheritance of all citizens. The Phoenicians had given the world more than just a writing system. They had given it the idea that literacy could be universal, that the power of written communication could belong to everyone. It was an idea that would transform human civilization in ways the Phoenician merchants could never have imagined. But to reach its full potential, the alphabet needed one more crucial innovation. It needed vowels. The Greeks took the Phoenician alphabet and broke it. Intentionally, the Phoenicians had given them consonants, strong, practical letters for a trading language. But Greek was different. Greek had vowels that mattered, sounds that changed meaning with the slightest shift in pronunciation. So they did something audacious. And they stole Phoenician letters they didn't need and turned them into the sounds they did. The result was the first alphabet that could capture not just words, but the music between them. The moment of transformation came sometime around 800 BCE, probably in one of the Greek trading posts that had sprung up throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Some Greek merchant or scribe, familiar with Phoenician writing but frustrated by its limitations, made a crucial observation. Several Phoenician letters represented consonant sounds that didn't exist in Greek. Instead of discarding these useless letters, this unknown innovator repurposed them to represent Greek vowel sounds. The Phoenician letter aleph, which represented a glottal stop the Greeks couldn't pronounce, became alpha, representing the vowel a. The letter he, used by Phoenicians for a breathy consonant sound, became epsilon, representing. Other Phoenician consonants were similarly converted. Ain became omicron for o, and new letters were eventually added for other vowel sounds that Phoenician didn't distinguish. This might seem like a minor technical adjustment, but it was revolutionary. For the first time in history, a writing system could represent the full sound structure of a spoken language. Every syllable could be written with precision. Every word could be spelled unambiguously. A text written in the Greek alphabet could be read aloud by someone who had never heard the language before, simply by following the letters. The earliest examples of Greek alphabetic writing appear on pottery fragments from the 8th century BCE. These aren't grand literary works, but simple inscriptions, names, dedications, even crude jokes. One famous piece, the Dipylon Oinako from Athens, bears what may be the earliest complete sentence in Greek alphabetic writing. Whoever of all the dancers performs most delicately, his this prize shall be. But even these humble beginnings reveal something profound about what the Greeks were doing with their new writing system. Unlike earlier scripts, which were primarily used for administration and record keeping, Greek alphabetic writing was being used for personal expression, artistic creation, and social communication from almost the moment of its invention. The reason becomes clear when we consider the nature of Greek society in the 8th century BCE. This was the era of the Greek Renaissance, when the dark age that had followed the collapse of Mycenaean civilization was finally ending. Greek cities were experiencing population growth, renewed trade, and cultural revival. It was also the era of Homer, when the great oral traditions of Greek epic poetry were being crystallized into their final form. The Greeks were uniquely positioned to appreciate what complete alphabetic writing could offer. They had a rich tradition of oral poetry that depended on precise meter and rhythm. They were developing new forms of political organization that required public debate and written laws. They were beginning to engage in philosophical inquiry that demanded exact definitions and careful reasoning. For all of these activities, a writing system that could capture the full range of spoken language was invaluable. The impact was almost immediate. By 750 BCE, Greek poets were using alphabetic writing to compose works that would have been impossible in any other medium. The precision of alphabetic notation allowed them to experiment with complex meters and intricate wordplay. The Iliad and Odyssey, though based on much older oral traditions, were likely first written down in alphabetic script during this period, preserving for all time what had previously existed only in the memories of professional bards. But the Greeks didn't stop with poetry. They quickly discovered that alphabetic writing was the perfect tool for the kind of analytical thinking they were beginning to develop. Philosophy, as we understand it, may have been impossible without the Greek alphabet. The careful definitions, logical arguments, and systematic reasoning that characterize Greek philosophical texts depend on the ability to record thoughts with precision and examine them at leisure. Consider the difference between oral and written reasoning. In oral culture, arguments must be memorable to be effective. They rely on rhetorical devices, emotional appeals, and traditional formulae. Written arguments, by contrast, can be complex, abstract, and cumulative. They can build step by step toward conclusions that would be impossible to hold in memory. The Greek alphabet made this kind of reasoning possible for the first time in human history. The political implications were equally profound. Greek democracy, the idea that ordinary citizens could participate in government, would have been impossible without widespread literacy. Democratic institutions require written laws that can be consulted by all citizens, written records of government decisions, and the ability to distribute information quickly and accurately. The Greek alphabet, because it was simple enough for ordinary people to learn, made democratic literacy possible. Archaeological evidence shows that Greek alphabetic literacy spread rapidly throughout the Greek world. Inscriptions appear not just on public monuments, but on private gravestones, commercial goods, and even children's toys. A piece of pottery from 7th century BC Athens bears the inscription, "I am Nestor's cup, good to drink from." Whoever drinks this cup, immediately the desire of beautiful crowned Aphrodite will seize him. This isn't official or religious writing, it's playful, creative, personal expression. The Greeks also developed new writing technologies to take advantage of their improved alphabet. They adopted papyrus from Egypt for formal documents and books, but they also used ostraka, pottery swords, for temporary notes and practice exercises. They developed new pen and ink technologies that made writing faster and more fluid. They even invented shorthand systems for rapid note-taking. Perhaps most importantly, the Greeks established the first schools specifically designed to teach alphabetic literacy. Unlike the scribal schools of Egypt and Mesopotamia, which trained professional scribes in complex traditional scripts, Greek schools aimed to teach basic reading and writing skills to all citizens. By the 5th century BCE, literacy was so widespread in Athens that political leaders could assume their audiences could read pamphlets and posted notices. The cultural transformation was remarkable. Within a few generations, Greek society had moved from primarily oral to primarily literate. This wasn't just a change in how information was stored, it was a change in how people thought. Written culture encouraged analytical thinking, systematic knowledge, and the preservation of individual ideas across generations. The Greeks also discovered that their alphabet could be adapted to write other languages. Greek colonies throughout the Mediterranean began using modified versions of the Greek alphabet to write local languages. In southern Italy, the Etruscans adopted a version of the Greek alphabet around 700 BCE. In the Black Sea region, the Greek alphabetic principles were applied to Thracian and Scythian languages. This adaptability pointed toward the alphabet's ultimate potential, a truly universal writing system that could be applied to any human language. The Greeks had solved the technical problem of representing vowel sounds, making the alphabet suitable for Indo-European languages with complex vowel systems. Other peoples would build on this achievement to create alphabetic scripts for languages from entirely different families. But perhaps the Greeks' most lasting contribution was their demonstration that widespread literacy could transform an entire civilization. The flowering of Greek art, literature, philosophy, science, and politics in the 4th centuries BCE was directly connected to the alphabetic revolution that had begun 3 centuries earlier. For the first time in history, a society had made the written word accessible to all its citizens, and the results were extraordinary. When a young Macedonian prince named Alexander set out to conquer the world in 336 BCE, he carried with him not just armies and weapons, but Greek books, Greek ideas, and the Greek alphabet. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from his conquests became laboratories for alphabetic literacy, spreading Greek learning and Greek letters across 3 continents. But even as Greek influence spread eastward, other people were adapting the alphabet for their own purposes in the West. The Romans, practical and pragmatic as always, would take the Greek achievement and engineer it for a different kind of empire, one that would carry alphabetic writing to the ends of the earth. Rome built roads to move armies. They built aqueducts to move water. But their greatest engineering project was invisible. They built highways for letters. The Latin alphabet wasn't the most beautiful or the most efficient, but it was something more valuable. It was portable. Roman soldiers carried it to Britain. Merchants shipped it to Spain. Administrators planted it in Gaul. And unlike those other highways, this one never crumbled. The Romans inherited their alphabet from the Etruscans, who had adapted it from the Greeks around 700 BCE. But where the Greeks had used their alphabet primarily for cultural and intellectual purposes, the Romans saw it as a tool of administration and conquest. They streamlined it, standardized it, and most importantly, they distributed across the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. The Latin alphabet that emerged from this process was a masterpiece of functional design. The Romans reduced the number of letters to a manageable set, originally 21, later expanded to 23, and standardized their forms for maximum legibility. They developed 2 basic styles: formal capitals for monumental inscriptions and cursive letters for everyday writing. They established clear rules for spelling and grammar that made Latin texts readable across the empire's vast territories. But the Roman alphabet's real innovation was its scalability. The same letters that graced the monuments of emperors could be scratched into a soldier's shield or carved into a merchant's seal. The same script that recorded the deliberations of the Senate could be used for a lover's note or a student's exercise. It was democratic in the most practical sense, suitable for any purpose, any social class, any level of education. Archaeological evidence reveals the extraordinary spread of Latin literacy throughout the Roman Empire. Inscriptions in Latin appear on everything from triumphal arches to soldiers' tombstones, from mile markers to shop signs. At Vindolanda, a Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall in northern England, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of wooden tablets with everyday Latin writing, duty rosters, supply requests, personal letters, even a birthday party invitation from one soldier's wife to another. These Vindolanda tablets reveal something remarkable about Roman literacy. It was widespread, practical, and personal. Ordinary soldiers, far from the centers of Roman culture, were writing letters home, keeping personal accounts, and maintaining official records. This wasn't just functional literacy, it was full participation in written culture. The Romans achieved this level of literacy through systematic education. Unlike earlier civilizations, where writing was the preserve of professional scribes, Rome developed a comprehensive educational system designed to produce literate citizens. Boys from wealthy families attended schools where they learned reading, writing, and rhetoric. Even slaves were often taught to read and write because literate slaves were more valuable. The curriculum was standardized across the empire. Students began by learning the alphabet, progressed to copying simple texts, and eventually studied the great works of Latin literature. The same textbooks were used from Britain to Africa, from Spain to Syria. This educational uniformity helped create a truly imperial culture in which a Roman citizen could travel from one end of the empire to the other and find familiar books, familiar forms of writing, and familiar intellectual traditions. Roman literature flourished under this system. Writers like Virgil, Ovid, and Tacitus created works that established Latin as one of the great literary languages of the ancient world. But equally important was the vast corpus of practical writing that Roman literacy made possible: legal codes, administrative manuals, technical treatises, historical chronicles, and personal correspondence. The legal implications were particularly significant. Roman law, with its emphasis on written statutes and recorded precedents, would have been impossible without widespread literacy. The 12 Tables, Rome's first written law code around 450 BC, were posted in the forum where any citizen could read them. Later legal developments, including the great compilations of Justinian, depended on the ability to record, copy, and distribute complex legal texts across vast distances. Roman engineering also benefited from alphabetic literacy. The Romans were the first civilization to develop comprehensive technical literature. Works like Vitruvius's De Architectura and Frontinus's De Aqueducta preserved engineering knowledge in written form, allowing techniques to be shared across the empire and transmitted to future generations. The consistency of Roman engineering. The fact that aqueducts in Spain resembled those in Syria was partly due to the circulation of written technical manuals. The Romans also revolutionized the physical aspects of writing. They developed new writing materials, including improved paper-like substances and durable inks. They perfected the Codex, the bound book format that replaced the earlier scroll, making texts easier to reference and more portable. They established scriptoriums, copying centers throughout the empire, where important texts could be reproduced for distribution. Perhaps most importantly, the Romans demonstrated that alphabetic literacy could be a tool of unity rather than division. Previous empires had typically imposed their languages and scripts on conquered peoples, creating resentment and resistance. The Romans took a different approach. They made Latin literacy advantageous. If you wanted to advance in Roman society, participate in Roman commerce, or benefit from Roman law, you needed to read and write Latin. But the Romans didn't prohibit local languages and scripts. They simply made Latin more useful. This practical approach made Latin the lingua franca of the ancient world. By the 10th century CE, educated people from Britain to Mesopotamia could communicate in written Latin. A merchant in Gaul could correspond with a supplier in Egypt. A student in Spain could read texts composed in Rome. A soldier in Germany could write reports that would be understood in Syria. The spread of Christianity added another dimension to Roman alphabetic literacy. Early Christian texts were written in Greek and Latin using the Roman alphabet, and Christian missionaries carried these texts throughout the empire and beyond. The Bible, translated into Latin by Jerome in the late 4th century, became one of the most widely copied and distributed texts in human history. When barbarian peoples began to adopt Christianity, they also adopted the Roman alphabet. Germanic tribes, Celtic peoples, and others developed their own languages using Latin letters. This created a cultural continuity that outlasted the Roman Empire itself. Long after the last emperor had fallen, the Roman alphabet continued to spread, carried by Christian missionaries to peoples who had never seen a Roman legionnaire. The fall of Rome in the 5th century CE didn't end the story of the Roman alphabet, it transformed it. As the empire fragmented into successor kingdoms, Latin remained the language of education, law, and religion throughout Western Europe. The Roman alphabet became the foundation for medieval European literacy, adapting to write vernacular languages like French, Spanish, German, and English. But even as it evolved, the Roman alphabet retained its essential character: simplicity, adaptability, and democratic accessibility. A peasant learning to write his name used the same basic letters as a scholar copying Virgil. A merchant keeping accounts used the same script as a monk illuminating a gospel. The alphabet that had once served Roman administrators now served medieval civilization. The Romans had accomplished something unprecedented in human history. They had created a writing system that could outlast the civilization that produced it. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform, which died with their parent cultures, the Roman alphabet proved so useful and adaptable that it continued to spread long after Rome itself had become a memory. By 400 CE, the Roman alphabet had established itself as the dominant writing system of Western Europe and much of the Mediterranean world. It had proven its value not just for Latin, but for dozens of other languages. It had demonstrated that a simple, standardized script could serve the needs of a complex, diverse civilization. The stage was set for the alphabet's next great expansion. As the Roman Empire gave way to medieval kingdoms, as Christianity spread beyond the former imperial borders, as new peoples encountered the power of written communication, the Roman alphabet would continue its conquest of the world. but that conquest would take new forms, shaped by new needs and new technologies. The next chapter in the alphabet's story would be written not in Latin, but in Arabic, not with Roman efficiency, but with Islamic elegance, not across European roads, but along the trade routes of the medieval world. Arabic script flows like water, curves like wind, connects like breath. To watch a calligrapher write Arabic is to see letters dance. But this beauty wasn't decoration, it was revolution. When the Islamic conquests spread across 3 continents, they carried with them a writing system that could bend to fit any language, any sound, any prayer. Arabic letters became the vehicles for Greek philosophy, Persian poetry, and mathematical innovations that would reshape human knowledge. The Arabic alphabet began as a minor variation of the Aramaic script, itself a descendant of the original Phoenician alphabet. But when Islam emerged in 7th century Arabia, this Hubble writing system was transformed into something extraordinary. The need to record and transmit the Quran with perfect accuracy drove innovations in Arabic writing that would influence literacy for centuries to come. The transformation began with Muhammad himself. According to Islamic tradition, the Prophet was illiterate. He could neither read nor write. But he understood the power of written words. When receiving the revelations that would become the Quran, he dictated them to scribes who recorded them in the Arabic script of the time. These early Quranic manuscripts, written on whatever materials were available, parchment, bone, stone, became the foundation for one of history's great literary and calligraphic traditions. But early Arabic writing was imperfect for recording the Quran. The script of 7th century Arabia consisted of only 18 basic letter forms, many of which looked identical except for the placement of dots. Different consonants shared the same basic shape, and vowels were not written at all. This ambiguity was acceptable for everyday writing among native speakers, but it was dangerous for a said text that demanded precise transmission. The solution came through a series of innovations spanning the late 7th and early 8th centuries. Under the Umayyad caliphs, scholars developed a system of diacritical marks, dots and short lines placed above and below letters that could distinguish between similar letter forms and indicate vowel sounds. This system, perfected during the Abbasid period, made it possible to write Arabics and the Quran with complete clarity and precision. The result was a writing system of unprecedented flexibility. The basic Arabic alphabet consisted of 28 letters, each with up to 4 different forms depending on its position in a word: initial, medial, final, or isolated. Combined with the diacritical system, this gave Arabic writing the ability to represent not just Arabic sounds but the sounds of any language into which Islam spread. And spread it did, with remarkable speed. Within a century of Muhammad's death, Islamic armies had conquered territories from Spain to Central Asia. Unlike previous conquests, which often imposed foreign languages on subject peoples, the Islamic expansion was accompanied by a gradual adoption of Arabic as a language of religion, scholarship, and administration. The Arabic alphabet followed, adapting to write dozens of different languages. In Persia, Arabic letters were modified to write Persian, adding several new letter forms to accommodate sounds that didn't exist in Arabic. The result was a beautiful script that could capture the nuances of Persian pottery while maintaining visual and cultural connections to the broader Islamic world. Persian poets like Ferdowsi and Hafs used this Arabic-based script to create some of the finest literature in any language. In Central Asia, Arabic letters were adapted to write Turkish languages, creating scripts that would be used for centuries across the Ottoman Empire. In South Asia, Arabic writing was modified for Urdu, creating a script that could handle the complex sound system of this Indo-European language. In Africa, Arabic letters were used to write languages like Hausa and Swahili, often for the first time in their history. The flexibility of Arabic script went beyond mere linguistic adaptation. Because the letters connected in flowing chains, Arabic writing could be shaped into artistic forms while remaining completely legible. Calligraphers developed numerous styles, from the bold Kiphic script used for monumental inscriptions to the elegant Nas script preferred for books and documents. Each style served different purposes, while maintaining the essential functionality of the writing system. This artistic dimension was crucial to Arabic script's success. In Islamic culture, calligraphy was considered the highest art form, higher than painting or sculpture, which were sometimes viewed with suspicion. Beautiful writing was not just decoration, but a form of worship, a way of honoring the divine word revealed in the Quran. This religious significance ensured Arabic calligraphy received the finest artistic attention and technical innovation. The Islamic world also revolutionized the technology of writing. While Europeans were still copying books laboriously by hand, Muslim scholars developed paper making techniques learned from China and established paper mills throughout the Islamic world. Baghdad alone had more than 100 paper mills by the 10th century. This cheap, abundant writing material made books affordable and literacy more widespread. Islamic libraries became legendary for their size and scope. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the 9th century, contained hundreds of thousands of volumes in Arabic, Persian, Greek, and other languages. Similar libraries flourished in Cordoba, Cairo, and other Islamic centers. These institutions weren't just repositories of books. They were centers of translation and scholarship where Arabic script was used to preserve and transmit knowledge from across the known world. The translation movement of the 8th and 9th centuries demonstrated Arabic writing's capacity to handle complex intellectual material. Greek philosophical and scientific texts were translated into Arabic with remarkable precision. Works by Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Galen were not just translated, but improved upon, with Arabic-speaking scholars adding their own insights and discoveries. Mathematical notation was revolutionized when Arabic scholars adopted Hindu numerals and developed algebraic notation using Arabic letters. Arabic script also proved adaptable to new genres and forms of writing. Islamic scholars developed sophisticated systems for citing sources, cross-referencing texts, and organizing knowledge. The Arabic alphabet was used to create some of history's first encyclopedias, biographical dictionaries, and scientific handbooks. It handled poetry as elegantly as prose, religious commentary as easily as secular literature. The geographic scope of Arabic writing was unprecedented. By 1000 CE, Arabic letters were being used to write in territories stretching from Spain to Indonesia, from Morocco to Central Asia. A scholar in Cordoba could correspond with a colleague in Samarkand using the same script, even if they spoke completely different languages. Arabic had become the Latin of the Islamic world, a unifying force that connected diverse peoples and cultures. This unity was particularly important for trade and commerce. Muslim merchants created commercial networks that spanned 3 continents, and Arabic script served as their common medium of communication. Business documents, contracts, and correspondence were written Arabic letters, whether the merchants were Persian, Turkish, Arab, or African. This linguistic and scriptural unity facilitated trade on a scale not seen since the Roman Empire. The influence of Arabic script extended beyond the Islamic world. During the medieval period, European scholars learning from Islamic sources often encountered Arabic writing for the first time. Some European texts show Arabic influence in their notation systems, particularly in mathematics and astronomy. The Arabic numerals that replaced Roman numerals in European mathematics are the most obvious example, but Arabic influence can also be seen in alchemical symbols and astronomical notation. When the Crusades brought Europeans into direct contact with the Islamic world, they encountered a civilization whose literacy and learning far exceeded their own. European scholars like Adelaide of Bath and Gerard of Cremona traveled to Islamic centers to study Arabic texts, often learning Arabic script in the process. Their translations of Arabic works into Latin helped trigger the European Renaissance. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Arabic script was its demonstration that writing could be both functional and beautiful, both practical and sacred. The Islamic tradition of calligraphy showed that the act of writing itself could be a form of art and worship. This idea would influence writing traditions around the world, from Ottoman Turkish to Mughal Persian to modern Arabic typography. The Arabic alphabet had proven that the basic Phoenician innovation, letters representing sounds, could be adapted to serve not just one language or one culture, but an entire civilization. It had shown that script could be a bridge between peoples rather than a barrier, a source of unity rather than division. As Islamic power waned in later centuries, the Arabic alphabet remained as a testament to the power of written communication to transcend political boundaries and create lasting cultural connections. The legacy of Islamic alphabetic innovation would continue to influence world literacy long after the medieval Islamic empires had faded. The Arabic script's flexibility and beauty had demonstrated new possibilities for what writing could be and do. But even as Arabic letters spread across the Islamic world, a different kind of revolution was brewing in the Christian monasteries and universities of medieval Europe, one that would take the ancient alphabet in an entirely new direction. Before Gutenberg, books were hand-copied treasures, each one a small miracle of patience and skill. A single Bible took a scribe nearly a year to complete. The alphabet existed, but it lived in chains, beautiful, expensive chains. Then, in a small workshop in Mainz, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg asked a dangerous question. What if letters could multiply? What if knowledge could breed? The printing press didn't just reproduce the alphabet, it unleashed it. The story begins not with genius but with frustration. Medieval Europe was experiencing an explosion of literacy and learning in the 14th and 15th centuries. Universities were multiplying, trade was expanding, and more people than ever before needed access to written texts. But the technology of book production hadn't changed since antiquity. Every book was still copied by hand, one letter at a time, by scribes working in monasteries or commercial scriptoriums. This created an impossible bottleneck. The University of Paris had about 2,000 students by 1300, but its library contained fewer than 1,000 books. A single copy of Aristotle's worked cost as much as a farm. Books were so valuable they were often chained to library shelves to prevent theft. Literacy was spreading faster than literature could be produced to feed it. Gutenberg's breakthrough came from combining all existing technologies in a new way. Movable type had been invented in China centuries earlier, but Chinese characters were too numerous and complex for the technique to be practical. Papermaking, also borrowed from China via the Islamic world, had made writing materials cheaper and more abundant. Wine presses and olive presses had perfected the technology of applying even pressure to flat surfaces. Gutenberg's genius was recognizing that these separate innovations could be combined to mass-produce alphabetic text. The key insight was that the Latin alphabet's small number of letters made movable type practical in a way it could never be for Chinese characters or Arabic script. With just 26 basic letter forms plus punctuation and ligatures, Gutenberg could create enough metal type to set entire pages of text. The pieces could be arranged, printed, then rearranged for the next page. It was alphabetic writing's greatest advantage, simplicity, finally finding its perfect application. But Gutenberg's movable type was more than just functional, it was beautiful. He spent years perfecting the design of his letters, creating metal type that reproduced the elegant script of the finest manuscript books. His 42-line Bible, completed around 1455, was so visually stunning that buyers often couldn't tell it apart from hand-lettered manuscripts. He had achieved mass production without sacrificing aesthetic quality. The impact was immediate and revolutionary. Within 50 years of Gutenberg's first Bible, printing presses had spread throughout Europe. By 1500, more than 1,000 of printing shops were operating in over 200 cities. These shops had produced an estimated 15-20 million books, more than all the manuscript books produced in the previous millennium combined. The alphabet had found its engine of mass reproduction, but printing did more than just make books cheaper and more abundant. It standardized the alphabet in ways that hand copying never could. When scribes copied texts, they inevitably introduced variations, different letter forms, spelling variants, grammatical changes. Printed books, by contrast, were identical copies that froze text in a standard form. For the first time, the same book read in London would be letter for letter identical to the same book read in Rome. This standardization had profound linguistic implications. National languages, which had existed in dozens of regional dialects, began to coalesce around printed forms. The German that Luther used for his Bible translation became Standard German. The English of the King James Bible helped stabilize English spelling and grammar. The Italian of printed Dante became the foundation for modern Italian. Printing didn't just spread languages, it created them. The Reformation demonstrated printing's revolutionary potential. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, the document was in print and circulating throughout Germany within weeks. Luther's German translation of the Bible, printed in multiple editions, made scripture directly accessible to ordinary readers for the first time. The printing press had broken the Catholic Church's monopoly on religious knowledge. But printing's impact went far beyond religion. Scientific knowledge, which had previously circulated slowly in manuscript copies, could now be shared rapidly across Europe. Copernicus, De Revolutionibus, 1543, and Vesalius's anatomy texts could be studied simultaneously by scholars from Portugal to Poland. The scientific revolution would have been impossible without the printing press to distribute its discoveries. The economics of printing also transformed authorship. For the first time, writers could earn a living from their work. The concept of intellectual property emerged as printers sought exclusive rights to publish popular works. Authors began writing for anonymous reading audiences rather than specific patrons. Literature became a commodity that could be bought and sold in marketplaces. New genres emerged that were specifically suited to print. Newspapers, which required rapid production and wide distribution, became possible. Novels, which depended on lengthy narratives and broad readership, flourished. Technical manuals, which needed precise diagrams and wide circulation, multiplied. Encyclopedias, which demanded comprehensive coverage and easy reference, appeared. Print had created new forms of knowledge and new ways of organizing information. The printing press also democratized learning in unprecedented ways. Cheap printed books made education accessible to classes of people who had never owned books before. Literacy rates soared as reading became a practical skill rather than an elite accomplishment. In Protestant regions, where Bible reading was encouraged, literacy became a religious duty as well as a practical necessity. Children's education was revolutionized. Printed primers and textbooks standardized instruction across entire regions. The alphabet itself became the subject of specialized books, ABCs and spelling primers that taught letter recognition and phonics to young readers. For the first time, learning to read could be systematized and scaled up to educate entire populations. The visual presentation of text also evolved. Early printed books had mimicked manuscript conventions with minimal spacing and punctuation. But printers gradually developed new typographic conventions, consistent spacing between words, standardized punctuation marks, numbered pages, tables of contents, and indexes. These innovations made printed texts easier to read and navigate than any manuscript had ever been. Different regions developed distinctive printing traditions. Italian humanist printers like Alucius created elegant italic typefaces and portable octavo books. German printers specialized in complex technical texts with detailed illustrations. Dutch printers became famous for the quality of their paper and ink. French printers developed sophisticated typography for poetry and literature. Each tradition contributed to the evolving grammar of print culture. The printing press also enabled the creation of truly international scholarly networks. Scholars could correspond not just through letters, through published works, but reached audiences they would never meet. Ideas could spread across linguistic and political boundaries with unprecedented speed. The Republic of Letters, the international community of scholars and intellectuals, was made possible by the printing press. By 1600, printing had fundamentally altered the relationship between the alphabet and human knowledge. Written texts were no longer rare treasures, but common commodities. Literacy was no longer an elite privilege, but an increasingly widespread skill. And knowledge was no longer confined to small circles of scholars, but could reach anyone who could read. The alphabet, which had begun as scratches on bones and evolved through clay tablets and papyrus scrolls, had found its most powerful expression in movable type. The same 26 letters that Phoenician traders had carried across the Mediterranean were now multiplying at unprecedented rates, and carrying human knowledge to every corner of the literate world. But even as printing transformed the alphabet's reach and power, new technologies were already emerging that would challenge its dominance once again. The age of mass literacy that printing had created would eventually give way to new forms of communication that threatened to make alphabetic writing obsolete. The alphabet's greatest triumph was also setting the stage for its next great test. Every email you send, every text you type, every search you make reduces to the same thing, combinations of 26 letters dancing through silicon and wire. The alphabet, born in ancient minds and perfected in medieval monasteries, has become the DNA of the digital age. But in a world of emojis, voice messages, and artificial intelligence, we must ask, has the alphabet finally met its match, or is it evolving into something even stranger? The digital revolution began with a paradox. The first computers were built to handle numbers, not words. They were calculating machines designed for artillery tables and atomic bomb calculations. Yet within decades, these number crunchers have become the most powerful text processing machines in human history. The bridge between numbers and letters was code, the transformation of alphabetic characters into binary digits that computers could manipulate. The crucial breakthrough came in the 1960s with the development of ASCII, American Standard Code for Information Interchange. ASCII assigned a unique number to each letter, digit, and symbol, creating a universal code that allowed any computer to represent any alphabetic text. The letter A became 65, B became 66, and so on. For the first time since cuneiform scribes pressed wedges into clay, written characters were being encoded into a completely different medium. But ASCII did more than just digitize the alphabet. It globalized it. Because early computer systems were developed primarily in English-speaking countries, ASCII enshrined the Latin alphabet as the default writing system of the digital age. When the internet emerged in the 1970s and 1980s, it carried ASCII encoding with it, making English letters the fundamental building blocks of digital communication. This had profound implications for global literacy. To participate in the digital world, speakers of non-Latin scripts had to either transliterate their languages into Latin letters or wait for more sophisticated encoding systems. The alphabet that Roman legions had carried across Europe was now conquering the world again, carried by fiber optic cables and satellite signals. The personal computer revolution of the 1980s and 1990s democratized digital writing in ways that echoed the original invention of the alphabet. Just as the Phoenician alphabet had made writing accessible to traders and merchants, personal computers made digital text creation available to ordinary people. Word processors replaced typewriters, email replaced postal mail, and suddenly millions of people were creating more text than ever before in human history. The internet transformed the alphabet's social function. Online forums, chat rooms, and early social media platforms created new forms of written conversation that blurred the line between speech and writing. People began typing the way they talked, developing new conventions like emoticons, abbreviations, and informal grammar. The alphabet was adapting to serve conversational functions it had never served before. Search engines like Google turned to net into a vast alphabetic index. Every web page became searchable by its textual content, creating a global library organized not by subject or author, but by the statistical patterns of letter combinations. The alphabet's power to organize information, first demonstrated in ancient libraries, reached its ultimate expression in algorithmic search. The smartphone revolution of the 2000s put alphabetic writing power into billions of pockets. Text messaging, with its character limits and tiny keyboards, created a new form of telegraphic writing that prioritized speed and brevity over formal grammar. Predictive text systems began completing words and phrases automatically, turning typing into a collaboration between human intention and algorithmic suggestion. Social media platforms like Twitter took this even further, imposing strict character limits that forced users to compress their thoughts into alphabetic miniatures. The art of writing within constraints, which had produced everything from haikus to sonnets, found new expression in 140-character tweets and Facebook status updates. But the digital age also challenged the alphabet's dominance in new ways. Multimedia communication allowed people to combine text with images, videos, and sounds. Emojis provided a new pictographic supplement to alphabetic writing, allowing nuanced emotional expression that letters alone couldn't capture. Voice messages let people communicate directly through speech, bypassing writing altogether. The rise of artificial intelligence has created perhaps the greatest challenge to traditional alphabetic literacy. Large language models like GPT can generate human-quality text from simple prompts, potentially reducing the need for humans to compose written language. Voice assistants allow people to interact with computers through speech rather than typing. Machine translation systems make it possible to communicate across languages without learning foreign alphabets. Yet rather than replacing the alphabet, these technologies have revealed its incredible resilience and adaptability. AI systems are trained on vast corpuses of alphabetic text, making them fundamentally dependent on written language. Voice assistants convert speech to text internally before processing commands. Machine translation works by analyzing patterns in alphabetic writing systems. The alphabet has also evolved new functions in the digital age. Programming languages use alphabetic characters to write code that controls computers. Domain names and email addresses use letters to create unique digital identities. Hashtags turn alphabetic phrases into searchable categories. URLs use letters to navigate the infinite space of the internet. Perhaps most remarkably, the alphabet has become self-modifying in the digital age. Autocorrect systems constantly adjust spelling and grammar, while predictive text influences how people compose sentences. Search engines shape language by promoting certain phrases and terms. Social media algorithms determine which alphabetic content reaches large audiences. The writing system is no longer just a tool for recording language, it's actively shaping how language develops. The global reach of digital communication has also created new forms of alphabetic multilingualism. People routinely switch between languages within single messages, creating hybrid texts that would have been impossible in earlier eras. Code switching, transliteration, and mixed script writing have become normal features of digital communication. The internet has also preserved and revitalized endangered alphabets and scripts, and communities speaking minority languages can now maintain written traditions online, creating digital archives and educational resources that ensure their scripts survive. The democratizing power of digital technology has given new life to writing systems that were declining in the print era. But the digital transformation has also raised new questions about the future of alphabetic literacy. As interfaces become more visual and voice-activated, will people still need to learn to read and write? As AI systems become better at generating text, will human writing skills become obsolete? As global communication relies increasingly on images and videos, will alphabetic writing remain relevant? The evidence so far suggests that the alphabet's flexibility and power make it indispensable even in a multimedia world. Digital literacy still fundamentally depends on alphabetic literacy. The most sophisticated AI systems still operate through text interfaces. The most complex multimedia productions still require alphabetic scripts for planning and coordination. The alphabet has also found new artistic expressions in digital media. ASCII art uses alphabetic characters to create images. Concrete poetry exploits the visual properties of letters on screen. Interactive fiction creates new narrative forms that depend on reader input through alphabetic interfaces. Digital typography has revolutionized the visual presentation of letters, creating new aesthetic possibilities for alphabetic design. Looking forward, the alphabet seems likely to remain central to human communication even as it continues to evolve. Augmented reality interfaces will layer alphabetic text over visual environments. Brain-computer interfaces may allow direct alphabetic input from thought. Quantum computing may create new forms of text encoding that transcend current binary limitations. The alphabet that began with Phoenician traders has become the operating system of human knowledge in the digital age. Every database, every search engine, Every AI system ultimately depends on the ability to encode, process, and retrieve alphabetic text. The same principles that made the alphabet successful in ancient markets, simplicity, flexibility, and universal applicability, have made it the dominant interface between humans and machines. Yet this success also represents a kind of invisibility. The alphabet has become so fundamental to digital communication that we barely notice it, like the Roman roads that outlasted the empire that built them. Alphabetic infrastructure now underlies technologies that seem to have transcended writing altogether. The haunting question is whether this invisibility represents triumph or obsolescence. Has the alphabet become so successful that it no longer needs human consciousness to sustain it? Or has it simply found new forms of life in digital environments that we're only beginning to understand? As we stand on the threshold of an age where machines write, read, and think in alphabetic patterns, we must ask whether the letters we inherited from ancient miners and traders are becoming something more than human, or something less. For every alphabet that survived, dozens died in silence. Mesopotamian cuneiform lasted 3,000 years before vanishing. Mayan glyphs encoded astronomy and prophecy before being forgotten in jungle ruins. Linear B preserved the accounts of Bronze Age palaces until the palaces burned and the script died with them. The alphabet, is a survivor, but it walks through a graveyard of letters that once seemed just as eternal. The archaeological record is littered with scripts that almost made it. In the Indus Valley, between 2600 and 900 BCE, a sophisticated civilization created a writing system with over 400 distinct signs. These symbols appear on seals, pottery, and bronze objects across a region larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Yet today, despite decades of scholarly effort, the Indus script remains undeciphered. We can see the letters, but we cannot hear the voices they once preserved. The silence is haunting because the Indus civilization shows every sign of sophisticated literacy. The consistency of their symbols across vast distances suggests standardized education and administration. The complexity of their city planning implies detailed record keeping. Yet when their cities were abandoned around 1900 BCE, their writing system vanished with them. No Rosetta Stone survived to bridge the gap between their symbols and our understanding. Linear A, the writing system of Minoan and Crete, presents a similar mystery. From roughly 1800 to 1450 BCE, Minoan scribes used this script to record what appears to be palace administration, religious ceremonies, and commercial transactions. We know Linear A was the ancestor of Linear B, which recorded ancient Greek and has been successfully deciphered. Yet Linear A itself remains opaque. Its underlying language unknown and possibly unrelated to any surviving language family. The tragedy is that we can see the sophistication of Minoan civilization in their art, architecture, and technology. Their palaces show complex social organization. Their frescoes reveal rich cultural traditions. Their trade networks spanned the eastern Mediterranean. They clearly had much to say and the means to record it. But their words are lost to us, locked in symbols we can see but cannot unlock. Some scripts died violent deaths. The Maya developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient Americas, capable of recording not just administrative data, but historical narratives, astronomical calculations, and religious poetry. Mayan scribes created libraries of bark paper books that preserved centuries of accumulated knowledge. Then Spanish conquistadors arrived and systematically destroyed these libraries as works of the devil. Bishop Diogo de Landa burned hundreds of Maya books in a single bonfire in 1562, erasing millennia of intellectual achievement in an afternoon. Only 4 Maya codices survived the destruction, preserved by accident in European collections. From these fragments and the stone inscriptions that proved impossible to destroy, scholars have painstakingly reconstructed the brilliance of Maya writing. But the loss is incalculable. Imagine if only 4 books had survived from all of European civilization, how much of our history, literature, and knowledge would be irretrievably lost. Other scripts died slower deaths, suffocated by political and cultural change. Egyptian hieroglyphs, which had served pharaonic civilization for over 3,000 years, gradually gave to Greek and Coptic writing as Egypt fell under Hellenistic and later Roman rule. The last hieroglyphic inscription was carved on the island of Philae in 394 CE, ending one of history's longest continuous writing traditions. For over a millennium afterward, hieroglyphs remained visible on temple walls and monument stones throughout Egypt, but no one could read them. Medieval Arab and European travelers could see that these symbols had once carried meaning, but the knowledge of how to interpret them had been lost. The script that had recorded the wisdom of ancient Egypt had become mere decoration, beautiful but mute. The fate of Rongorongo, the enigmatic script of Easter Island, illustrates how quickly writing systems can disappear when their cultural context collapses. Rongorongo appears to have been a sophisticated system of symbolic notation used by Rapa Nui Islanders to record chants, genealogies, and possibly astronomical observations. But by the time European anthropologists became interested in the script in the 19th century, the knowledge of how to read it had already been lost. The collapse of Rapa Nui society through ecological disaster, slave raids, and disease had broken the chain of transmission that kept Rongorongo alive. The few surviving tablets were collected by museums as curiosities. But without native speakers who could explain their meaning, the script joined the ranks of the undeciphered. An entire intellectual tradition vanished within a generation or two. Sometimes scripts were deliberately abandoned for political reasons. When Ataturk modernized Turkey in the 1920s, he replaced the Arabic script that had been used for Ottoman Turkish with a modified Latin alphabet. The change was part of a broader effort to westernize and secularize Turkish society, but it had the unintended consequence of making centuries of Turkish literature inaccessible to new generations. Books, documents, and inscriptions that had been perfectly readable became as foreign as hieroglyphs. The Soviet Union conducted similar script reforms, forcing dozens of minority languages to abandon traditional scripts and adopt Cyrillic or Latin alternatives. These changes were often justified as modernization, but they severed connections between communities and their written heritage. Languages that had used Arabic-based scripts for centuries were suddenly forced to reinvent their orthographies, often losing literary traditions in the process. Some scripts survive only in the memories of scholars. Ogham, the ancient Irish script that used combinations of lines and notches cut into stone, was still being used in medieval Ireland, but gradually gave way to Latin letters as Christianity spread. Today, Ogham inscriptions can be found throughout Ireland and Western Britain, but they remain curiosities for specialists rather than living parts of Irish culture. The technological dimension of script death is equally important. Cuneiform died partly because clay tablets became obsolete as writing materials. Papyrus scripts vanished when paper replaced papyrus. Manuscript traditions ended when printing made hand copying economically unnecessary. Each technological transition created opportunities for some scripts to flourish while condemning others to obsolescence. But perhaps the most poignant losses are the scripts that almost made it, the near misses of alphabetic history. The old Nubian script, used in medieval Sudan, was a sophisticated adaptation of Coptic letters that served a Christian kingdom for centuries. The Tangut script, used in the Western Shah kingdom of medieval China, encoded a rich literary tradition in a language related to Tibetan. The Rongorongo script of Easter Island may have been developing into a full writing system when European contact disrupted its evolution. These scripts failed not because they were inferior, because their societies faced insurmountable challenges. Environmental collapse, military conquest, cultural assimilation, technological disruption, any of these could destroy a writing tradition that had taken centuries to develop. The alphabet we use today survived not just because it was effective, but because it was lucky. The digital age has created new forms of script death. Fonts that become obsolete, file formats that become unreadable, websites that vanish from the internet all represent new ways that written records can be lost. The same technologies that have democratized writing have also made it more fragile. A hard drive crash can destroy a library. A server shutdown can erase a culture. Yet the digital age has also created new opportunities for script resurrection. Linear B was deciphered using early computers to analyze symbol patterns. Maya glyphs yielded their secrets partly through digital databases that allowed scholars to compare inscriptions across vast geographic areas. Machine learning algorithms are now being applied to undeciphered scripts like Linear A and the Indus Valley symbols, offering hope that some lost voices might yet be recovered. The lesson of lost scripts is humbling. Every writing system, no matter how successful or sophisticated, exists in a state of perpetual vulnerability. The alphabet we inherit is not a permanent achievement, but a temporary victory in an ongoing struggle between preservation and entropy. The letters we write today may someday join the ranks of the undeciphered, puzzling future archaeologists, just as Indus Valley symbols puzzle us. But there's also something hopeful in the persistence of human attempts to record meaning. Even when scripts die, the human impulse to write continues. New systems emerge to replace the old, new symbols arise to carry forward the eternal human desire to make thought visible, to preserve meaning across time, to speak to the future from the present. The graveyard of lost letters reminds us that our alphabet is precious precisely because it is fragile. Every time we write, we participate in an act of faith, the belief that our marks will matter, that our words will endure, that the future will still remember how to read what we have written. The scripts that died teach us to treasure the letters that survived. The alphabet that began with scratches on bone now lives in quantum computers and streams through fiber optic cables at the speed of light. But its greatest test lies ahead, as artificial intelligence learns to think in patterns we can barely comprehend, as genetic code becomes a new kind of writing. As humans prepare to carry letters to other worlds, we face an ancient question with new urgency. Will the alphabet we inherited from Phoenician traders and Roman soldiers prove strong enough to hold our expanding universe of meaning? The signs of transformation are everywhere. Children today learn to write by tapping glass screens instead of holding pencils. They communicate through emojis that supplement and sometimes replace alphabetic text. They speak to machines that understand their words and respond in kind. They inhabit virtual worlds where text floats in three-dimensional space and words can be sculpted like clay. Yet beneath these surface changes, the alphabet persists with remarkable tenacity. Every app icon contains alphabetic labels. Every search requires typed queries. Every social media post depends on letter forms that would be recognizable to a Roman scribe. The infrastructure of digital civilization runs on alphabetic protocols, HTTP, HTML, URL, API, all acronyms built from the same letters that once adored Roman monuments. The emergence of artificial intelligence has created the alphabet's strangest new chapter. Large language models like GPT process text with superhuman speed and fluency, yet they remain fundamentally dependent on alphabetic input. They cannot think without letters, cannot reason without words, cannot imagine without the vocabulary humans have given them. In a sense, AI has become the alphabet's most sophisticated reader and its most prolific writer. This creates a fascinating paradox. Machines that can write poetry indistinguishable from human poetry still cannot understand what poetry means. They can generate perfect prose without comprehending what it feels like to read. They manipulate symbols with extraordinary skill while remaining fundamentally symbol manipulators rather than symbol understanders. The alphabet has found its most powerful expression in minds that may not be minds at all. The biological frontier presents equally profound challenges. As scientists learn to read and write genetic code, DNA is becoming a new form of text, one that encodes not just information but life itself. The four-letter alphabet of genetic bases NOA, TGCT operates according to grammatical rules as complex as any human language. Scientists are already using genetic code to store digital information, writing Shakespeare's sonnets in sonetic DNA and retrieving them with perfect fidelity. This suggests a future where the boundary between alphabetic and genetic writing dissolves. Programmable organisms could carry libraries in their cells. Human memories could be encoded in DNA and passed down through generations. The alphabet might literally become part of our biology, inscribed not just in our tools but in our genes. Space exploration poses another fundamental challenge. When humans establish permanent settlements on Mars or other worlds, they will need communication systems that work across interplanetary distances. Radio signals take up to 24 minutes to travel between Earth and Mars, making real-time conversation impossible. Text messages become the only practical form of communication, but what kind of text? The alphabet's universality makes it the obvious choice for interplanetary communication. Unlike pictographic or ideographic systems, alphabetic writing can be learned quickly by anyone who needs it. A Martian colony could develop its own dialect and still maintain alphabetic communication with Earth, but the extreme delays involved might also drive the evolution of new forms of compressed, information-dense writing that pack maximum meaning into minimum space. Virtual and augmented reality technologies are already changing how we interact with alphabetic text. Instead of reading flat pages, we can walk through libraries where words float in space. Instead of typing on keyboards, we can write with gestures that leave trails of letters in the air. Instead of books that stay the same each time we read them, we can encounter texts that respond to our presence and adapt to our interests. These developments point toward a future where the alphabet becomes three-dimensional, interactive, and responsive. Text might escape the tyranny of the page entirely, becoming environmental, architectural, atmospheric. We might live inside our texts rather than simply reading them. But the most profound question is whether the alphabet can survive its own success. As voice interfaces become more sophisticated, as brain-computer interfaces develop, as AI systems learn to communicate directly with each other, will humans still need to read and write? Could we return to a primarily oral culture, supported by machines that handle all our textual needs? The answer may depend on what we think reading and writing actually do for us. If they're just tools for storing and transmitting information, then better tools might make them obsolete. But if they're fundamental to how we think, learn, and understand ourselves, then they'll survive in whatever form serves those deeper purposes. Current research suggests that reading and writing literally rewire the human brain, and creating neural pathways that exist only in literate individuals. These pathways don't just process text, they support abstract reasoning, analytical thinking, and complex planning. The alphabet isn't just a communication tool, it's a cognitive technology that shapes how our minds work. This neurological dimension suggests that the alphabet will persist as long as we want to think in the ways that literacy enables. Even if we develop perfect voice interfaces and thought-reading machines, we might still choose to read and write because the processes themselves are valuable, not just their outputs. The alphabet is also likely to survive because of its role in creative expression. Poetry, literature, and experimental writing push the boundaries of what alphabetic systems can do. Artists and writers continue to discover new possibilities in the arrangement of letters, the rhythm of words, the visual presentation of text. As long as humans are creative, they'll find new ways to make letters dance. The global perspective adds another layer of complexity. While English and the Latin alphabet dominate digital communication today, other writing systems are asserting themselves online. Chinese characters, Arabic script, Devanagari, and dozens of other systems are developing their own digital traditions. The future of writing may be multilingual and multiscript in ways we can barely imagine. Climate change and environmental crisis also cast shadows over the alphabet's future. Digital storage requires enormous energy consumption and rare earth minerals. The server farms that host our text consume electricity equivalent to entire countries. As environmental pressures mount, we may need to develop more sustainable forms of textual communication or return to older, less energy-intensive writing technologies. The democratization of artificial intelligence means that soon anyone will be able to generate unlimited amounts of text on any topic. This abundance may paradoxically make human-authored text more valuable, not less. In a world flooded with machine-generated content, the alphabet's role may shift from information storage to authenticity verification. We may learn to read not just for content, but for evidence of human consciousness behind the words. Looking even further ahead, the possibility of contact with non-human intelligence raises the ultimate question about alphabetic writing. If we encounter alien civilizations, will they have developed writing systems we can understand? Will the alphabet prove universal enough to serve as a bridge between worlds, or will we need entirely new forms of symbolic communication? The alphabet's 4,000-year history suggests it will adapt rather than disappear. It has survived the fall of empires, the rise of new technologies, and countless predictions of its obsolescence. It has proved remarkably flexible, serving the needs of countless languages, cultures, and civilizations. Its simplicity is its strength, and 26 letters that can be combined in infinite ways to express anything humans need to say. Yet the challenges ahead are unlike any the alphabet has faced before. Machine intelligence, genetic engineering, space exploration, environmental crisis, and the possibility of non-human contact all represent qualitatively new pressures on human communication systems. The next century may determine whether the alphabet continues its conquest of human consciousness or gives way to something we cannot yet imagine. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the alphabet's future is that it remains unwritten. Unlike the clay tablets of Mesopotamia or the stone inscriptions of Egypt, tomorrow's words exist only as possibility. The letters that will shape the future are still waiting to be formed, still ready to carry whatever meanings we choose to give them. The alphabet that began in ancient minds may end among the stars, or it may transform into something so different we wouldn't recognize it as writing at all. But whatever form it takes, it will carry forward the essential human impulse that created the first scratches on Ice Age bone, the refusal to let meaning die, the insistence that thoughts can outlive thinkers, the faith that today's words can reach tomorrow's minds. In the end, the alphabet's future depends not on technology but on us. As long as we have something to say and believe it's worth preserving, we'll find ways to say it. The letters may change, the media may evolve, but the human voice will continue seeking ways to speak across time and space. The story of the alphabet is still being written, and you, reading these words right now, are helping to write it. The story of the alphabet is not the story of 26 letters. It's the story of humanity's refusal to let meaning die with the voice that spoke it. Every mark we've made, from those first tally lines on mammoth bone to the words flowing across your screen right now, represents the same impossible hope. That thoughts can outlive thinkers, that today's whisper can become tomorrow's shout. We began in Ice Age caves where someone, whose name we'll never know, felt compelled to scratch meaning into bone. They couldn't have imagined that their simple marks would evolve into Sumerian wedges pressed into clay, Egyptian birds and eyes carved in stone, Phoenician letters sailing across the Mediterranean, Greek vowels singing through symposiums, Roman capitals marching across continents, Arabic curves flowing through medieval libraries, Gothic manuscripts glowing in monastery scriptoriums, printed books multiplying in Renaissance workshops, and digital text streaming through fiber optic cables at the speed of light. Each transformation brought both loss and gain. The Ice Age tallies lost their immediacy, but gained durability. Mesopotamian tokens lost their three-dimensional reality, but gained the ability to represent abstract concepts. Egyptian hieroglyphs lost their pictorial clarity, but gained the power to capture sound. The Phoenician alphabet lost its visual beauty, but gained democratic accessibility. Greek letters lost their Semitic origins, but gained vowel precision. Roman capitals lost their Greek elegance, but gained imperial reach. Arabic script lost its Arabian simplicity, but gained global flexibility. Medieval manuscripts lost their classical purity, but gained artistic magnificence. Printed books lost their handmade uniqueness, but gained mass accessibility. Digital text lost its physical permanence, but gained infinite reproducibility. Through every change, something essential persisted: the human conviction that marks can hold meaning, that symbols can preserve thoughts, that the invisible can be made visible. This conviction has proved stronger than empires, more durable than monuments, more persistent than any technology we've devised to serve it. The haunting truth is that we're still those cave dwellers, still scratching marks in the dark, still hoping someone will understand. The medium has changed, a bone to clay to papyrus to paper to screen, but the message remains the same. We were here. We thought, we felt, we knew something worth preserving. Every text ever written, from shopping lists to sacred scriptures, carries this basic assertion of human significance. The alphabet didn't end with Rome or begin with Phoenicia. It began the moment a human being realized that the inside of their head could be made visible to the inside of someone else's. It will end only when we stop believing that our thoughts are worth preserving, when we cease to hope the day's words can reach tomorrow's minds. But that ending seems unlikely. Despite predictions that television would kill reading, that computers would eliminate writing, that voice interfaces would make typing obsolete, alphabetic literacy has not only survived but flourished. More people can read and write today than in all previous centuries combined. More text is being created daily than was produced in entire previous eras. The alphabet has found new forms, new purposes, new expressions that its creators could never have imagined. What makes this persistence remarkable is not just the alphabet's adaptability, but its democracy. Unlike other human achievements that remain accessible only to specialists, alphabetic literacy can belong to anyone willing to learn a small set of symbols. A child mastering the ABCs is entering the same tradition as Homer composing the Iliad, Cicero addressing the Senate, or Shakespeare writing his sonnets. The barriers to entry are minimal, the rewards are infinite. This democratic character may be the alphabet's greatest strength as it faces an uncertain future. Whatever technological changes lie ahead, the basic human need to share meaning across minds will persist. Whether that sharing happens through neural interfaces, quantum computers, or technologies we haven't yet imagined, it will likely require some system for encoding thought into transmissible form. The alphabet's simplicity and flexibility make it a natural candidate for any such system. Yet we must also acknowledge what we've lost in our journey from marks on bone to marks on screens. Something irreplaceable was present in those early writing systems that tied symbols directly to the physical world. Egyptian hieroglyphs that looked like what they represented, Mesopotamian tokens you could hold in your hand, cave paintings that required you to venture into darkness to see them. Our increasingly abstract and dematerialized writing systems have gained efficiency but lost tactile connection to reality. The future of the alphabet may require recovering some of that lost physicality while maintaining the advantages of digital technology, virtual and augmented reality interfaces that let us sculpt words in space, haptic feedback systems that restore the sense of touch to writing, brain-computer interfaces that make the alphabet feel internal rather than external. All of these technologies hint at ways the alphabet might become more embodied rather than less. But perhaps the most important lesson from the alphabet's long history is that its survival depends not on any particular technology, but on the human community that sustains it. Writing systems die when the societies that use them collapse or abandon them. They survive when each generation chooses to learn them, use them, and pass them on. This means the alphabet's future is not predetermined by technological forces, but depends on millions of individual decisions. Parents teaching children to read, teachers explaining grammar, writers experimenting with new forms, readers choosing books over other entertainments. Every time someone decides that alphabetic literacy matters, they cast a vote for the alphabet's continued existence. The story we've traced from Ice Age caves to digital networks reveals something profound about human nature. We are the species that writes. We alone among Earth's creatures have developed the capacity to externalize thought, to make memory permanent, to speak across time and space through symbols. This capacity has made us what we are, builders of civilizations, preservers of knowledge, storytellers of our own existence. The alphabet, in its many forms and transformations, has been the primary vehicle for this uniquely human achievement. It has carried us from the darkness of prehistory into the light of history, from isolated communities to global networks, from oral traditions to written cultures. It has made possible everything we think of as civilization, law, literature, science, philosophy, education, democracy. Yet the alphabet's greatest achievement maybe more personal than political, more intimate than institutional. It has given every literate person the power to make their thoughts permanent, to speak to the future, to participate in the great human conversation that spans millennia. When you write a letter, compose an email, or jot a note, you join a tradition that stretches back to Mesopotamian scribes, Egyptian priests, Phoenician merchants, Greek philosophers, Roman administrators, Arabic calligraphers, medieval monks, Renaissance humanists, and millions of ordinary people who believed their words mattered enough to preserve. In this sense, the alphabet belongs not to any particular culture or era but to the entire human species. It is part of our biological inheritance, like language itself, a capacity that emerges naturally from the structure of human minds and societies. Like other fundamental human technologies, fire, tools, cooking, and the alphabet has become so integrated into our existence that we can barely imagine life without it. This integration suggests that reports of the alphabet's death may be greatly exaggerated. As long as humans need to preserve meaning across time and space, some form of symbolic notation will persist. That notation may evolve, transform, or even become unrecognizable to us. But it will carry forward the essential insight that first emerged in those Ice Age caves. Thoughts can take physical form. Our minds can touch other minds across the void, meaning can survive the bodies that create it. The alphabet that began with Phoenician traders may indeed end among the stars, carried to other worlds by human explorers who need to maintain contact with Earth. Or it may evolve into forms of communication we cannot yet imagine, in quantum entangled thoughts, genetically encoded memories, or direct neural transmission. Whatever form it takes, it will represent the continuation of humanity's oldest and most essential project, the refusal to let consciousness remain isolated and mortal. As we stand at the beginning of the 21st century, surrounded by technologies that would seem magical to our ancestors, we might feel disconnected from those first mark makers in their Ice Age caves. But every time we write, we perform the same fundamental act they did. We take something invisible and make it visible, something ephemeral and make it permanent, something private and make it shareable. We assert that our thoughts matter enough to preserve, that the future is worth speaking to, that meaning can outlive the minds that create it. The alphabet story is still being written, one letter at a time, by everyone who chooses to read these words and perhaps write their own in response. In that sense, you are not just reading about the history of writing, you are participating in it, extending it, helping to determine what happens next. The first marks were made in darkness, by firelight, by hands that had never seen written words before. The latest marks are made in the glow of screens, by fingers that have never known a world without writing. Between that first cave painter and this current reader stretches an unbroken chain of people who believed that marks could mean something, that symbols could hold significance, that thoughts could travel from one mind to another through the simple magic of arranged letters. That chain remains unbroken. Every time someone learns to read, every time someone decides to write, every time someone chooses meaning over silence, the chain grows stronger. The alphabet we inherited from ancient miners and medieval monks continues its conquest of human consciousness, not through force but through utility, not through coercion but through choice. The future remains unwritten, waiting for the next marks, the next meanings, the next minds brave enough to believe that their thoughts deserve permanence. The alphabet that began with necessity and evolved through ingenuity now depends on hope. The hope that there will always be something worth saying and someone worth saying it to. In the end, that may be the alphabet's most remarkable achievement. It has made hope visible. Every written word represents a bet that the future will be there to read it. That meaning will persist, that the conversation between minds continue across any distance and any duration. The alphabet doesn't just record human thoughts, it embodies human faith in the value of thought itself. That faith has carried us from the first scratches on mammoth bone to the last pixels on quantum screens. Where it carries us next depends on whether we continue to believe that our marks matter, that our meanings deserve preservation, that the human voice, however it chooses to express itself, is worth hearing across the ages. The alphabet story ends where it began, with a human hand making a mark and hoping someone, somewhere, somewhen will understand what it means to be human. The marks change, the media evolve, but the hope remains constant. As long as we remain human, we will continue to write. And as long as we write, the alphabet, in whatever form it takes, will continue to carry our thoughts into the infinite unknown of tomorrow. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.